The fluorescent lights of the Save Mart hummed with a sterile, rhythmic buzz that usually calmed Elena's nerves. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the air smelled faintly of floor wax and overripe bananas. She leaned over the organic produce bin, her hand hovering over a carton of strawberries. The only thing her 3-year-old would eat this week. She looked different now than she did 3 years ago. Her hair was styled in a sharp, elegant bob, and her silk blouse shimmered under the grocery store lights. But the woman beneath the silk still remembered the cold. Still buying the expensive stuff on someone else's dime, I see. Some things never change. The voice hit her like a bucket of ice water. It was a nasal, arrogant drawl she hadn't heard since the night she was left on a curb with nothing but a positive pregnancy test and a trash bag full of clothes. Elena froze, her fingers tightening around the plastic strawberry container. She didn't have to turn around to know it was Marcus. When she finally faced him, he looked exactly as she remembered. Expensive sneakers, a counterfeit designer watch, and an expression that suggested he owned every room he walked into. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her wedding ring with a sneer. "Look at you," Marcus laughed, the sound grating and loud enough to make a nearby elderly shopper flinch. "Playing dress-up. Who'd you trick into taking care of you, Elena? Or are you still just a charity case?" "I'm shopping for my family, Marcus," Elena said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Move your cart. You're blocking the aisle." "Oh, she's got a backbone now," he mocked, stepping closer until he was firmly in her personal space. He smelled of cheap cologne and unearned confidence. "You think because you put on some jewelry and a nice coat, you're better than the girl I kicked out of my apartment? You were nothing then, and you're nothing now. Just a broke girl from the neighborhood trying to act like she belongs in the suburbs." Elena tried to push past him, her cart rattling. "I'm not doing this with you. Move." "I don't think so." Marcus's face darkened, his ego bruised by her lack of fear. He wanted the old Elena, the one who would cry or plead for his approval. When she tried to navigate around him, he reached out and planted a hand firmly on her shoulder. With a sneer of pure, unfiltered disdain, he gave her a violent, dismissive shove. "Know your place." Elena stumbled back, her heels skidding on the polished linoleum. She hit the edge of a display tower of canned soup, the metal corners digging into her back as she fought to keep her balance. The strawberry container flew from her hand, bursting open on the floor. The bright red fruit scattered across the white tiles like droplets of blood. Marcus stood over her, laughing, completely unaware that the store's security cameras were catching every second. He didn't notice the two men in dark suits at the end of the aisle suddenly reaching for their earpieces. He didn't see the way the air in the room seemed to grow heavy, or the way the store manager's face went pale as he looked toward the entrance. Marcus thought he was the predator in a room full of prey. He didn't realize that by laying a hand on the wife of the man who currently owned the very land the supermarket sat upon, he had just signed the warrant for his own undoing. Elena stood up slowly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "You're going to regret that, Marcus," she said quietly. "Regret what? Pushing some trash out of my way?" Marcus laughed, leaning against his cart. "Call the cops. See if they care." "I'm not calling the police," Elena replied, her thumb hovering over a speed dial contact labeled with a single elegant K. "I'm calling my husband. The rain didn't just fall that night. It punished. It was a cold, driving deluge that turned the city streets into a blurred mosaic of gray and charcoal." Elena stood on the cracked sidewalk of the apartment complex, her fingers numbing as she clutched the handles of two overflowing trash bags. They were heavy, filled with the remnants of a life she thought she was building, but the plastic was stretching, nearing its breaking point, much like she was. Behind the glass of the front door, Marcus stood in the warm amber glow of the lobby. He didn't look remorseful. He looked annoyed, as if the sight of her standing in the storm was a smudge on his window he couldn't quite wipe away. He had always been a man of grand promises and microscopic delivery, but this was a new depth. "Marcus, please," she had whispered, though the wind snatched the words from her lips before they could reach him. "I have nowhere to go. My mom is in the hospital and I told you, I'm 6 weeks along. It's your baby." He didn't open the door. He didn't even lean closer to hear her. He simply checked his watch. The same flashy, gold-plated one he'd bought with the money she'd saved for rent, and mouthed 2 words through the glass: "Not mine." The cruelty of it was a physical blow. Elena's knees buckled slightly, her soaked sneakers slipping on the slick pavement. She remembered the way the rain felt through her thin cardigan, the chill seeping into her bones and settling in her womb, making her curl protectively over a life that was currently the size of a sweet pea. She was 22, broke, and suddenly invisible to the man who had promised her the world only months prior. She watched him turn his back on her. He walked toward the elevator, his stride light, whistling a tune she couldn't hear. He didn't look back. He didn't care if she slept in the park or under a bridge. To Marcus, Elena was an expired subscription, something to be canceled the moment the free trial of her devotion required actual effort. One of the trash bags finally gave way. A cheap ceramic frame, holding a photo of them at the state fair, shattered against the concrete. The glass mimicked the sound of her heart, a sharp crystalline snap. She knelt in the puddles, her hands trembling as she tried to scoop up her soaked clothes, her tears indistinguishable from the rain streaming down her face. She remembered looking up at the sky, and the thunder rolling like a heavy drum in her chest, and making a silent, desperate vow. She wouldn't just survive, she would become someone Marcus couldn't even stand in the shadow of. She didn't know then about the destiny waiting for her in a small, quiet tea shop 6 months later, or the man with the steady hands and the sharp suits, who would see her struggle and offer her a kingdom instead of a curb. In that moment, she was just a girl in the rain. But as the memory faded and the bright, harsh lights of the Save Mart snapped back into focus, Elena realized the rain had finally stopped. The girl in the cardigan was gone. Standing in the produce aisle, surrounded by the wreckage of the strawberries Marcus had just ruined, was a woman who no longer had to beg for a place to stay. She was the queen of a very different kind of world. And the ghost of the girl in the rain was finally ready to be laid to rest. The silence following Elena's mention of a husband was brief, punctuated only by the distant chime of a register. Marcus let out a bark of laughter that drew the attention of a mother 3 aisles over, his head tossing back in a display of performative disbelief. He leaned his elbows on the handle of his cart, looming over the mess of crushed strawberries as if they were a trophy of his dominance. "Husband?" he sneered, the word dripping with mockery. "Who'd marry you, Elena? Really? I bet he's some shiftless loser working 2 jobs just to keep you in those knockoff clothes. Or maybe he's just an imaginary friend you made up to keep from crying yourself to sleep at night." Elena stood her ground, her phone gripped firmly in her palm. And the screen glowed with the active call, a silent lifeline to a man Marcus couldn't begin to comprehend. She didn't respond to the bait. She simply watched him, her eyes cool and analytical. This was the man she had once wept over. This loud, fragile ego contained in a designer tracksuit. The realization of how small he actually was felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. "You're still alone, Elena," Marcus continued, his voice rising as he grew agitated by her lack of a breakdown. "Look at you, standing in the middle of a Save Mart covered in fruit, waiting for a hero who isn't coming. You were always needy. Always looking for someone to save you because you're too weak to stand on your own. I did you a favor 3 years ago. I cut the dead weight. And look at me now. I'm doing just fine. Meanwhile, yeah, you're still the same pathetic girl standing in the rain, just in a better lighting package." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, blocking the overhead light. He reached out a finger, intending to flick her shoulder in a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "You've got 5 minutes before I tell the manager you're harassing me. Why don't you pick up your mess and crawl back to whatever hole you came from? A girl like you doesn't belong in a neighborhood like this. You're a ghost, Elena. A nobody married to a nobody." Elena didn't flinch as his hand approached. She didn't have to. From the corner of her eye, she saw a flicker of movement, a dark shape detaching itself from the end of the aisle. The two men in suits she had noticed earlier were no longer just watching. They were closing in with a synchronized, predatory grace. "I'm not alone, Marcus," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more power than his shouting. "I haven't been alone for a very long time. But you're standing in a room full of people who are watching you commit career suicide, and you're too arrogant to notice the floor is falling out from under you." Marcus opened his mouth to deliver another insult, a jagged retort about her delusions of grandeur. But the words died in his throat. The air in the aisle suddenly felt pressurized, cold and heavy. He felt a hand, encased in a leather glove, settle onto his wrist, the one he was using to point at Elena. The grip wasn't just firm, it was absolute. "The lady asked you to move your cart," a voice said from behind him. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a mechanical, terrifying stillness. Marcus spun around, at his bravado crumbling into a mask of confusion. He found himself staring into the chest of a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. Behind that man stood another, and another, forming a wall of black wool and dark sunglasses. The supermarket, which had felt like Marcus's stage only moments ago, had suddenly been transformed into a cage. And for the first time in 3 years, Marcus looked like he finally understood the meaning of the word consequence. The heavy silence of the men in suits was a language Marcus didn't yet speak. He stared at the hand on his wrist, his brain frantically trying to categorize this interruption as a misunderstanding or a stroke of bad luck. He pulled his arm back, a nervous, jagged laugh escaping his lips as he adjusted his jacket. He looked at the wall of muscle before him and then back to Elena, who stood amidst the ruins of the strawberries with a composure that was starting to feel haunting. "What is this? Your brothers? You hired some bodyguards with your rent money to scare me?" Marcus's voice jumped an octave, the pitch of a man losing his grip on the narrative. He turned his attention back to the shoppers who were now lingering, sensing the shift in the room's gravity. "Hey, everyone see this? This woman is trying to intimidate me because I told her the truth about herself. She's a fraud." Elena didn't raise her voice to match his. She didn't defend her character or recount the list of his betrayals. Instead, she slowly raised her phone to her ear. The screen reflected in her dark eyes, showing the call had been active for the last 3 minutes. She hadn't been waiting for the men in the aisle to act. She had been waiting for a different kind of permission. "He's here," Elena said into the receiver. Her voice was as smooth as silk and as sharp as a razor. "He's doing exactly what you said he would. He hasn't changed at all." Marcus snorted, crossing his arms over his chest in a desperate bid to look unbothered. "Who are you talking to? Your imaginary king? Tell him to come down here so I can tell him to his face what a mistake he made picking up my leftovers." He looked around, playing to an imaginary audience. She's delusional. Truly. Making phone calls to a ghost while she stands in a grocery store. This is embarrassing, Elena. Even for you. But Elena wasn't looking at Marcus anymore. She was looking past him, toward the automatic sliding doors at the front of the store. The store manager, a man who usually moved with the harried energy of a retail veteran, was now standing perfectly still by the registers, his hands clasped in front of him, bowing his head in a gesture of profound, terrified respect. The rhythmic thrum-thrum of high-end engines idling in the fire lane vibrated through the glass. Marcus laughed again, but it died in his throat when he noticed the shoppers near the windows backing away, their faces pale. The usual bustle of the Save Mart went dead. The registers stopped beeping. The only sound was the clicking of a pair of handmade leather shoes walking across the linoleum, a steady, deliberate cadence that sounded like a countdown. "You really think you're something, don't you?" Marcus hissed, stepping toward Elena one last time, ignoring the men in suits who were now stepping aside to create a path. "You think some guy in a suit is going to change the fact that you're nothing? I'm the only one who ever saw you for what you—" He never finished the sentence. A hand, gloved in charcoal leather, descended onto Marcus's shoulder. It wasn't a shove like the one Marcus had given Elena. It was a grounding force, a weight that seemed to anchor Marcus to the spot and drain the air from his lungs. Elena lowered her phone. A small, knowing smile played on her lips, the first one Marcus had seen since the day he left her. It wasn't a smile of malice, but of absolute, settled victory. She looked at the man who had just stepped into the light behind Marcus, and for the first time in the encounter, Marcus felt the sudden, freezing realization that the ghost Elena had been talking to was very, very real, and he was standing right behind him. The store's automatic doors slid open with a hiss that sounded like a held breath finally being released. Outside, the midday sun glinted off the obsidian finish of 3 armored SUVs that had surged into the fire lane with the precision of a motorcade. They didn't just park, they occupied the space, their engines emitting a low, predatory growl that vibrated through the Save Mart's glass frontage. The store's interior lighting seemed to dim by comparison as the shadows of the vehicles stretched across the lobby, claiming the territory. Inside, the atmosphere underwent a violent chemical change. The casual chatter of the checkout lines evaporated, replaced by a heavy metallic tension. Shoppers froze in the aisles, in their hands hovering over cereal boxes and milk cartons, eyes wide as they watched the perimeter of the store being quietly, efficiently secured. 2 more men in charcoal overcoats stepped through the entrance, their gazes sweeping the room with the dispassionate intensity of hawks. They didn't look like security guards. They looked like soldiers of a sovereign nation no one dared to cross. Marcus felt the shift in his marrow. The bravado that had fueled his tirade only moments ago began to leak out of him, leaving a hollow, cold sensation in his gut. He tried to turn his head, to see the man whose hand still rested with leaden weight on his shoulder, but his neck felt as though it were locked in a vice. The air around him grew cold, smelling of rain, expensive tobacco, and the ozone scent that precedes a lightning strike. "The SUVs?" Someone whispered near the pharmacy counter. "Is that him?" The store manager, who had been a fixture of the neighborhood for 20 years, backed away from the registers. He didn't just move aside, he retreated into a bow, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor tiles. The display of absolute, unblinking deference was more terrifying to Marcus than any shout could have been. It signaled a hierarchy Marcus hadn't even known existed, a world where his petty bullying and counterfeit status were less than dust. Elena remained perfectly still, a calm island in the center of the rising storm. She looked at Marcus, and for the first time, her expression wasn't one of hurt or even anger. It was pity. She saw the sweat beginning to bead on his upper lip, the way his fingers twitched against the handle of his cart, and the frantic, darting motion of his eyes as he realized the exit was no longer an option. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been obliterated and rebuilt in her image. The man behind Marcus finally moved, stepping around him with a slow, rhythmic grace that commanded the very molecules of the room. He was a vision of sharp lines and dark silk, his presence so immense that the grocery store seemed to shrink around him. He didn't look at Marcus. To him, the man who had shoved his wife was an obstacle to be cleared, a minor glitch in an otherwise perfect afternoon. He walked straight to Elena, his eyes softening only when they met hers. Marcus tried to speak, to offer some stammering excuse or a joke to break the suffocating pressure, but his voice failed him. The sound of the idling engines outside seemed to grow louder, a rhythmic pulsing that matched the panicked beat of his heart. The shadow had arrived, and it had brought with it the cold, hard reality that the woman Marcus had discarded was the most protected person in the city. The supermarket was no longer a place of commerce, it was a court, and the judge had just taken his seat. Kenji did not enter the room so much as he reclaimed it. As he stepped fully into the light of the produce aisle, the contrast between the two men became a study in the difference between a yapping dog and a silent wolf. Marcus was a creature of noise, of loud sneakers, flashy logos, and a voice that strained to prove its own importance. Kenji, however, was a master of silence. He wore a suit that cost more than Marcus's entire life history, tailored with such precision that it seemed to absorb the store's harsh fluorescent glare into its dark, ink-blue fibers. His face was a mask of aristocratic calm, his features sharp and handsome, possessing the kind of stillness that only comes from a man who has never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. While Marcus had spent the last 10 minutes sweating and pacing, Kenji moved with a predatory economy of motion. He didn't look at the crowd, and he certainly didn't look at the cameras. He looked only at Elena. "Are you hurt?" Kenji asked. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that cut through the humming store like a cello note in a construction zone. He reached out, his hand, scarred slightly across the knuckles but impeccably groomed, gently cupping Elena's cheek. "I'm fine, Kenji," Elena replied, her voice finally losing its defensive edge and melting into something warm and certain. "Just a few ruined strawberries." Kenji's eyes flickered down to the red stains on the floor, then slowly, agonizingly, they traveled upward to fix on Marcus. The shift was visceral. It was as if the temperature in the aisle had dropped 20 degrees. Marcus, who had spent years leaning on his height and his loud mouth to intimidate women, suddenly looked small. He looked cheap. His counterfeit watch seemed to dim under the weight of Kenji's stare, and the arrogant tilt of his head collapsed into a frantic, submissive hunch. I didn't know," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. The loud-mouthed king of the Save Mart was gone, replaced by a man whose knees were visibly shaking. "I mean, we have a history, you know? It was just a joke, just a little push between old friends. Right, Elena?" Kenji didn't blink. He didn't even acknowledge Marcus's attempt at camaraderie. He simply stepped closer, invading Marcus's space with a terrifying, calm deliberation. He was half a head taller than Marcus, but he felt like a mountain. "You laid your hands on my wife," Kenji said, the words so quiet they were almost a whisper, yet they carried the weight of a death sentence. "You spoke to her as if she were beneath you. You stood in this public place and attempted to diminish a woman who is worth more than the air you are currently wasting." Marcus tried to swallow, but his throat had turned to sand. He looked to the left and right, hoping for an opening, a witness, or a way out. But he saw only the impassive faces of Kenji's men, a ring of iron that had closed around him. He looked at Kenji's eyes and saw no anger there. Anger would have been human. What he saw instead was the cold, clinical assessment of a man deciding how to dispose of a nuisance. The contrast was absolute. Marcus was the embodiment of a hollow ego, a man who built himself up by tearing others down. Kenji was the embodiment of true power, the kind that doesn't need to shout because it owns the very ground beneath your feet. In the shadow of the Mafia boss, Marcus finally saw himself for what he truly was, a small, loud man who had made the last mistake of his life. Kenji didn't move closer, yet Marcus recoiled as if he had been struck. The air in the aisle was so still that the faint drip of juice from the crushed strawberries sounded like a ticking clock. Kenji reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a slim charcoal gray leather wallet, but he didn't take out money. Instead, he pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a printed record that looked stark and clinical against his expensive gloves. "Marcus Thorne," Kenji began, his voice devoid of any heat, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "A man of many debts and very few assets. You currently owe 3 months of back rent on a studio apartment you can't afford. You've changed your phone number 4 times in the last year to dodge creditors. And your designer wardrobe? financed by a series of predatory payday loans that are currently being sold to a collection agency I happened to acquire last Tuesday. Marcus's face went from a sickly pale to a mottled, dusty gray. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic, wet clicking sound came from his throat. He looked at the paper in Kenji's hand as if it were a supernatural weapon. "But your financial failures are of little interest to me," Kenji continued, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "What interests me is a rainy Tuesday 3 years ago, the night you decided that a pregnant woman was an inconvenience to your lifestyle. The night you watched her through a glass door while she stood in a storm with her life in trash bags. You thought that because she had no one to call that night, she would have no one forever." The surrounding crowd, which had been watching in rapt silence, let out a collective, sharp intake of breath. The mother in the next aisle looked at Marcus with a sudden, visceral disgust. The store manager's eyes hardened. The narrative Marcus had tried to spin, that Elena was a charity case, was being dismantled with surgical precision. "I make it my business to know the history of everything I treasure," Kenji whispered, stepping just an inch closer, forcing Marcus to lean back dangerously far over a display of canned peas. "I know about the eviction. I know about the 'not mine' you mouthed through the glass. I know that while you were out spending what little money you had on bottle service to impress strangers, Elena was working 12-hour shifts at a tea shop, carrying your child, and building a life out of the wreckage you left behind." Marcus's knees finally gave out, and he slumped against the handle of his grocery cart, the metal rattling mockingly. It was a long time ago," he stammered, his eyes darting toward Elena, pleading for a mercy he had never shown her. "I was young. I made a mistake. Elena, tell him. We were both kids." "She was a mother," Kenji corrected him, his tone dropping to a growl that vibrated in the floorboards. "You were a coward, and the mistake you made wasn't leaving her. The mistake you made was thinking that the world would remain as small and as cruel as you are. You see, Marcus, when I met Elena, I didn't see a leftover. I saw a woman who had survived a monster and came out with a heart still capable of grace. I spent 2 years earning the right to stand beside her. And you think you can walk into a supermarket and push her? You think you can treat a queen like a ghost?" Kenji handed the folded paper to one of the men in suits without looking away from Marcus. "I don't just know your past, Marcus. I own your future. Every debt you have, every lease you've signed, every bridge you haven't yet burned, it all leads back to me now." The revelation hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Marcus looked up at the man he had called a nobody, and for the first time he realized that Elena hadn't just moved on. She had ascended to a height where he was nothing more than a speck of dust, and the man holding the broom was finally ready to sweep. The shift in the room was no longer just atmospheric, it was gravitational. Marcus felt the weight of 100 judgmental eyes pinning him to the spot. But it was the silent, obsidian gaze of Kenji that made his lungs feel as though they were filling with concrete. Desperation, sharp and acidic, clawed at the back of his throat. He looked at the circle of men in suits, then at the sleek SUVs idling outside, and finally at the woman he had shoved. He tried to summon the old Marcus, the one who could talk his way out of a debt or charm his way into a second chance. But the man staring back at him was a hollow shell. "Elena, baby, look," Marcus started, his voice a frantic, high-pitched warble. He reached out a trembling hand toward her, but a sharp look from Kenji made him jerk it back as if he'd touched a hot stove. "I was just stressed. You know how I get. The watch, the debts. It's been a hard year. I didn't mean any of it. I'm happy for you. Really. You found someone who can provide. That's what I always wanted for you." The lie was so transparent it felt like a physical insult to the air. Elena didn't even blink. She stood with her arms crossed, watching him with the detached curiosity one might afford an insect under glass. Seeing that his charm was failing, Marcus's desperation curdled into a final pathetic spark of rage. His ego, bruised and cornered, lashed out one last time. He straightened his back, trying to reclaim some of his lost height, and glared at Kenji. You think you're so tough because you've got guys in suits? This is a free country. You can't touch me in the middle of a grocery store. I'll sue you for everything you've got. I'll go to the press. Mafia boss harasses innocent citizen. How does that sound for a headline? He took a defiant step forward, his chest puffed out, aiming a trembling finger at Kenji's face. It was a move born of pure, unadulterated stupidity. Before Marcus's finger could even level with Kenji's chin, the world blurred. One of the men in suits moved with a speed that defied the bulk of his frame. In a single fluid motion, Marcus's arm was caught and twisted behind his back. The sound of Marcus's shoulder joint straining against the pressure was a sickening creak that echoed through the quiet aisle. His face was slammed into the edge of his own grocery cart, the metal mesh biting into his cheek. You talk too much, the man whispered into Marcus's ear, his voice as flat as a tombstone. Kenji hadn't even flinched. He hadn't moved a muscle. He simply looked down at Marcus, who was now pinned against a pile of discounted laundry detergent, his bravado leaking out in the form of a whimpering sob. You mention the law, Kenji said, his voice terrifyingly soft, but you forget that the law is a luxury for those who respect it. You shoved a pregnant woman into the rain. You shoved my wife in this store. You have forfeited your right to be treated with the civility you so clearly lack. Kenji looked over at the store manager, who was still frozen in a state of terrified reverence. I believe this man is trespassing, Kenji stated, though it wasn't a question. And I believe he has caused a significant amount of property damage to your produce section. I'll be sending my associates to settle the bill for the strawberries. And for the inconvenience. The manager nodded vigorously, his head bobbing like a toy. Of course, Mr. Park. Whatever you need. He's barred. Permanently. Marcus tried to thrash, but the grip on his arm only tightened, sending a fresh bolt of agony through his frame. He looked up, his eyes watering, and realized that no one was coming to help him. Not the shoppers, not the staff, and certainly not the law he had just tried to invoke. He was socially, financially, and physically erased. He was a non-entity in the presence of a king. Kenji leaned down, his face inches from Marcus's ear. The world is very small for men like you, Marcus, and I've just made it much, much smaller. The pressure in the aisle didn't ease until Kenji stepped back, giving Elena the space she needed to close the distance. Marcus was still pinned, his face pressed against the cold metal of the grocery cart, looking up at her with eyes that were wide, bloodshot, and frantic. For years, this was the man who had occupied the darkest corners of her memory, the giant who had loomed over her life and told her she was nothing. But as she stood over him now, she realized he wasn't a giant. He was a small, shivering ghost. Elena leaned down slightly, not out of aggression, but so she wouldn't have to raise her voice. The silence in the store was absolute. Even the humming refrigerators seemed to quiet as she spoke. You spent so much time today talking about what I used to be, Marcus, she said, her voice steady and resonant, devoid of the tremors that had plagued her youth. You talked about the girl in the rain. You talked about the charity case. You even talked about who I belonged to, but you never once looked at who I actually became. She reached out, but not to strike him. She simply adjusted the collar of his jacket, a gesture of chillingly calm pity that made him flinch more than a punch would have. I used to stay awake at night wondering what I would say to you if I ever saw you again. I thought I'd want to scream. I thought I'd want to see you suffer the way I did when I was shivering on that sidewalk, she continued, her gaze unwavering. But standing here now, looking at you, I don't feel anger. I don't even feel hate. I just feel relief. Because the man who tried to break me is so incredibly insignificant that I can't even remember why his opinion used to matter. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg or to offer one last hollow excuse, but Elena held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. "You told me to know my place," she said, a faint, sharp smile touching her lips. "I know exactly where my place is. It's in a home filled with love. It's in a life where I am respected. It's in a world where men like you are nothing more than a footnote in a story that turned out beautiful." She turned her gaze to the man holding Marcus down. "Let him go." The bodyguard looked to Kenji, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The grip was released, and Marcus slumped to the floor, his legs too weak to support the weight of his own shame. He stayed there, huddled among the spilled fruit and the scuff marks of high-end leather shoes. "Don't ever speak my name again," Elena said, her voice dropping to a final, cold whisper. "Don't look for me. Don't think of me. Because from this moment on, you don't exist in my world. You are just a shadow I walked through to get to the light." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. Elena turned her back on him, her silk blouse catching the light as she walked toward her husband. The dignity she had reclaimed wasn't something Marcus had given back to her. It was something she had owned all along, hidden beneath the trauma, waiting for the moment she was strong enough to reach for it. As she took Kenji's offered arm, the crowd parted like a sea of witnesses to a coronation. She had delivered her verdict, and the sentence was simple. Marcus was forgotten. The heavy glass doors of the Save Mart hissed open one final time, welcoming the trio into the crisp afternoon air. The sound of the supermarket, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the whispers of the stunned onlookers, and the pathetic, muffled sobs of a man left behind on the floor faded into a distant, inconsequential murmur. Out here, the sun was bright, catching the chrome of the waiting vehicles and the soft, polished sheen of the world Elena now inhabited. A side door of the center SUV opened, and a young girl with bouncy dark curls and bright, inquisitive eyes leaned out. "Mama, did you get the strawberries?" The tension that had held Elena's shoulders rigid for the last 30 minutes dissolved instantly. She reached the car and scooped Maya into her arms, inhaling the sweet, innocent scent of baby shampoo and sunshine. This was the child Marcus had dismissed as a mistake through a rainy window. Here she was now, a vibrant, thriving legacy of a love he was too small to understand. "I got them, baby," Elena whispered, kissing the girl's forehead. "But we might have to go to a different store for the next batch. These ones were a little bruised." Kenji stepped up behind them, his presence no longer a shield of cold iron, but a warm, enveloping cloak. He placed a steady hand on the small of Elena's back, a gesture of quiet devotion that spoke louder than any of Marcus's empty boasts. He didn't look back at the store. He didn't check to see if his men were finishing the task of erasing Marcus's influence from the neighborhood. For Kenji, the trash had been collected. His only focus now was the family that occupied the center of his universe. "Everything is ready," Kenji said softly, his voice losing the jagged edge of the boss and returning to the tenderness of a husband. "The garden is set for tea, and Maya's new books arrived this morning." As they settled into the plush leather interior of the vehicle, the motorcade began to move with a synchronized, silent grace. Elena looked out the tinted window as they swept past the storefront. She saw the flash of the black SUVs reflecting in the glass, a temporary scar on the mundane landscape of the shopping center. She knew that by tomorrow the gossip would spread, and by next week, Marcus would be a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of the city. But for her, the story was already over. She looked at her daughter, who was busy telling Kenji about a drawing she had made at school, and then at Kenji, who listened to the 3-year-old with the same rapt attention he gave to international mergers. This was her reality, a happily ever after that wasn't built on a fairy tale, but on the hard-won ground of respect, protection, and the fierce resilience of a woman who refused to stay broken. The girl in the rain was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth was not defined by who had left her, but by who had stayed. As the city skyline blurred into the distance, Elena leaned her head against Kenji's shoulder and closed her eyes. The air was clear, the path was wide, and for the first time in 3 years, the forecast held nothing but sun.